Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to the Design at Large seminar. As you know, our theme for this quarter is the way in which physical architectures, digital architectures, and social architectures are shaping our lives and experiences. And you know, in so many ways, I can't think of a better person to speak to these questions than Karahalios. Karrie is a professor at UIUC, and today, if you open up the newspaper, you know, as I did this morning, nearly every single day, social computing is in the news in some way, shape, or form. You know, Facebook was in 2 of the headlines in the top section of the New York Times on my phone this morning. It's just pervasive now, and in particular, Karrie's topic today is especially pervasive and timely right now. But not that long ago, very few academics were studying social computing, and very few people were thinking about social computing. It was kind of this like weird fringe thing. And one thing that I've always really admired about Karrie and her work is that she saw, before a lot of us did, how influential social computing was going to be on our lives. And I'm just so happy that Karrie's here today to speak with us. Welcome.
Thank you all for having me. I'm very honored to be here today. And thank you for that introduction. It's a lot to live up to. I'm gonna tell a story today, and that story is going to be about how we started studying news feeds. And throughout that story, a new story is going to weave in about some of the challenges that we encountered. So I'm just going to start, and I'd like to keep this informal if possible. So feel free to interrupt and ask any questions you might have. So algorithms shape many of our lives. How many of you use Twitter? Okay, many of you. One of the first glimpses of algorithms in Twitter was the trending topics over here. And these are pretty innocuous at first. You don't really notice them. They were there like, great, something is trending. But typically, people start getting really angry about algorithms when they break. And there was a time when Justin Bieber was trending nonstop, and then one day he wasn't. And a bunch of teenage girls got really, really, really upset to the point that Twitter released an announcement saying that we changed the trending algorithm. We changed it, don't worry. Things were trending so much all the time, they wanted some things in valleys that might peak to also start trending. This community of teenage girls got a little upset, and so they gamed the system. They started tweeting about Bieber, like mixing up the first letters of the 2 names and just swapping them. And they got their idol trending again. But the point I'm trying to make here is that people notice these algorithms when they don't behave the way they expect them to. Another example where we see different types of algorithms are in Google News. In this case, you actually have an option to personalize those algorithms for you. Polyvore is another site that uses algorithms to order outfits that you see or sets of outfits that you see. So why is this one here and this one down here? It's very hard to tell by looking at this site. Similarly with Behance, I love the aesthetic of this site, but I can't tell if I'm supposed to read it up, down, left, right. What does the upper left mean versus the bottom right? And this ordering and prioritization of ordering is becoming more and more critical. This case is a little sad. This is the exact same question on Google. Why is Caillou bald? In this one, I asked the question on Comcast in my apartment in San Francisco, where I'm visiting this year. In this one, oh, is that me? Oh, in this one, I asked the question, same apartment, different network, also in San Francisco, right next door. The question is, why is he bald? This one, which is the one that I was hoping would come out, was Caillou was initially created as a baby of 9 months, decided that he would never have any hair, and he went on to become popular as a little boy who was bald. His baldness may make him different, but we hope it helps children understand that being different isn't just okay, it's normal. This one, within seconds of the other one, says Caillou can't grow hair not because he has cancer or progeria, but because he sucks, and even his own body recognizes that he does not deserve hair or food. And I can't even finish that sentence. But this idea is that this is the same query within seconds. What is it? What in the algorithm made them pop up differently in the same location? We're seeing more and more of these feeds in the quantified self movement. This is from Fitbit. Where I get really excited, though, and confused, but mostly excited, is when we move towards social media again. So I already showed you Twitter in the beginning with the trending topics. But now, when you go to Twitter, if you haven't been there for a while, you get this in case you missed it. reading on top. And you start seeing things that Twitter thinks you should see. When I went to Coursera, it started telling me what courses it thought I should take. And again, social media is what got us most excited. And I got really, really excited about this, not because I use Facebook, because I'm probably the most antisocial user of social media today, but I'm intrigued by the affordances of it. I mean, this is the ultimate social catalyst. When I was studying piazzas as a graduate student, this is, and forgive me for maybe misappropriating this or using it wrongly, but it's the ultimate beyond being there when it comes to conversation. It also provides for cue variety, feedback, message personalization, being reminded of the need to talk to someone, having a communication channel, turn-taking, repair, stylized openings. I mean, all of these features just sort of like fell into this tool, and it became extremely popular. With that popularity also came some confusion because the mode for communication was different. And for us, one day, a group of 4 researchers sitting in a room, we sat there and trying to figure out why this post that my amazing colleague Christian Sandvik posted was just sitting at the top of our feeds for over 2 weeks. It was a parody post, you know, apparently it was amusing because of the reviews it got on Amazon, but it stuck there for 2 weeks. So we sat there on meetings for a period of like 2 months trying to figure out why that happened. And we made our own Facebook groups, we made Facebook pages, we started liking each other's things, trying to figure out if there any way we could make sense of what the algorithm was doing. And we had to take a few steps back and start simple. And the result was a tool called FeedViz. This is probably the 20th iteration of how it started. This was built by Motahari Islami, a PhD student. And we did a study because we couldn't figure out how to make sense of the feed. We wanted to see how other people tried to make sense of this feed. And so what you're looking at here on the left is all the posts made on Facebook by people in your network. On the right are the posts that have appeared in your feed. And so at a glance, what people first saw was that this right column was about 1/3 the size of the left column. Again, in white, we made the posts that you didn't see, and in blue, or this light grays that appears here, are the posts that you did see. Another example of this same interface is here. So for example, I see these, but I didn't see anything here in white. And we brought people to the lab. We asked them to use our tool, and we call this a narrative visualization. It's a series of visualizations where we guide people through the system to see how they make sense of it. The next view people saw was a people view. The earlier one was a content view. And so here what you're looking at on the left are 3 people whose posts you never see. In the middle are posts where you see some of their posts. On the right are 3 people where you see all of their posts. And you can refresh, and the list grows and grows and grows. And people started getting really angry around this point because they're like, why don't I see any of the posts posted by these people over here? And people got mostly angry if family members appeared here or here and not in this category where they felt they should belong. And so in bringing all these people into the lab, we started looking at their levels of awareness. We asked up front before they came in how many people were aware that there was an algorithm behind Facebook's feed. And it turns out that 37% of people, 37.5 were aware, and the rest were not aware. We were trying to figure out what helped them become aware. But first we asked people that were unaware if they would have seen certain posts throughout the day. And they said, well, I bet it would be on my newsfeed. I probably would catch it at some point during the day, or I probably don't scroll down enough, but you can't always scroll down so much. You just go like a few posts and that's it. If I want to go back to my story, it's accessible. Basically, they were blaming themselves. They were like, it's there. If I didn't see it, it was because I missed it, not because the interface didn't show it to me. The paths to awareness were roughly split. Some people compared deductively. They're like, I have like 900 and some friends. I feel like I only see 30 of them in my feed, so I know that something's going on. I just don't know what it is exactly. People were comparing across their different platforms. So the phone newsfeed is different from laptop newsfeed. Sometimes like I look at something on my phone, but when I go online, there's a ton more. So it's where you look. And other people were like, there's just too much material in general. It's not possible to see all of it. Or I mean, I have 250 friends, but some have 1,000. And if it wants to show everything, there's no way it crashes your computer. We also looked at some of the features that might influence whether or not people were aware of the algorithm. It turns out it does not matter how long you've been a member of Facebook, the ratio of seen content to total content, or the size of your network. What did matter was usage frequency. Some people looked at Facebook over 20 times a day. Your activity level. If you were a poster you were more likely to be aware of the algorithm than if you were a listener. If you managed a Facebook page, you were more aware of it. There was this gentleman who had a business, and he knew more about the feed than I could even imagine. And he would also get these weekly summaries because he was really interested in increasing viewing on his page. And also people who use the controls. And this actually caused quite some anger in our studies. It turns out people just assumed that they saw the stories in chronological order, even though they had a timestamp. The timestamp was right there, but people made this assumption. And they would switch to recent stories, but after a while, the interface automatically takes you back to top stories. Reactions, and I've already said a few, but they ranged from conspiracy theories to more subtle reactions. So initially, and I need to stress initially, there was surprise. So do they actually hide all these things from me? And hey, someone said it's kind of intense because have you seen the movie The Matrix? It's kind of waking up in the Matrix in a way. I mean, you have what you think of as your reality, of like what they choose to show you. And what the hell, Facebook? After moving down, I'm super frustrated. But there was also this like revelation of like uncovering misperceptions. I know she had some family issues, so I just thought she deactivated her account. Or I've never seen her post anything, and I always assumed that I wasn't really that close to that person, so that's fine. What the hell? It turns out people got really upset when they saw posts from a friend asking for help and they couldn't help them. People really, really wanted to help, and they were thinking, wow, this might explain why I made that post the other day and I got 0 likes for it. It finally started clicking for them as they were experiencing this. In terms of expectations, continuing from that, I think she needs support for that, mentioning to a not shown story. So if I see it, then I will say something to support her. And this idea of support came up again and again and again. People really wanted to support people and were upset when they couldn't. For now, I cannot really understand how they categorize these people. Actually, this is my brother pointing to the sometimes seen category in the middle, and actually he needs to be here pointing to the mostly seen. To evaluate to some degree whether or not these reactions, like how to calibrate them, we made another view towards the end. These were the people that were in the rarely seen category, in the sometimes, in the mostly seen. And we asked people to move them around to the categories they believe they should be in. And we did the same with content. For example, these are posts that you saw. We asked you to click on them if you didn't want to see them. And these were posts that you hadn't seen, and we asked you to click on them if you did want to see them. And what people started seeing in this view was that, wow, it's not that bad after all. I adore Eric, but maybe I don't need to know that it's his dad's birthday. Maybe it's okay that I didn't get that message. And it turns out that overall with the content view, people were really satisfied with the feed. At the end of the intervention, people were saying a lot of what is filtered out are things that don't really pertain to me. I'm so grateful because otherwise it would just clutter up what I really want to see. Or honestly, I have nothing to change, which I'm surprised because I came in like, they're screwing it all. Throughout this, people were creating folk theories. And I'm not going to go into too much detail of this. If you're interested, I can send you a paper. But we were really inspired by some of Kempton's work. And he had done a lot of studies of thermostats. Many of you may be familiar with this work, so I'm just going to summarize it very briefly. But he interviewed people who used thermostats. And he found out, in asking them how they worked, that their theories primarily fell into 2 categories. One category being a switch, meaning that if the temperature got too low, the thermostat would kick in. Another being more like a valve, like water, like opening the knob, and the more you open it, the more water comes out, the more heat comes out in that sense. It turns out that the experts kind of claim that the switch theory is the correct theory. But what he found was that in each of these objective theories, they each produced inefficiencies and advantages. And it was almost difficult to tell how better usage just from having the correct theory. And we're really curious to probe that here. And so we asked the people who were aware of the algorithm what some theories might be. They came up with a personal engagement theory, meaning how much you clicked and commented, global popularity theory of content, a format theory, meaning whether it's a story, a text, a picture, narcissist theory, things that I like are what I see. And then after the probe, we asked them what their theories were. And the list of theories increased, and it turned out to match the theories of the folks who were unaware of the algorithm in the first place. And so in doing this, I'm going to talk a little bit about this after follow-up, but it turns out these folk theories were very, very useful to folks. And it wasn't as important whether they were correct or not. It got them thinking about new hypotheses that they were testing. And we discovered this in the follow-up. We contacted them 2 to 6 months after the study. And Most people, 80%, had the same satisfaction or higher satisfaction with the feed. I'm more interested in checking Facebook because it does not seem as cluttered with random information. It turns out they were, from what they learned and from experimenting and using their folk theories, they were actually playing games with the interface and saying like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that, to try to game the system. People actually use the phrase, I'm manipulating the manipulation. Because I know now that not everything I post everyone will see. I feel less snub when I make posts that get minimal or no response. It feels less personal. Some people were still disappointed. I'm disappointed because I keep thinking that I might be missing some of the updates from my friends. I don't trust the news feed about giving me updates on everything I want to know. But these folks were experimenting with the system. And one of my favorite experiments that came up a lot was this idea of liking something and then hiding it. So one of the people in our study said, I get lots and lots of baby photos, and I feel obligated to click like on them. And I do, but I don't want to see as many of them. So as soon as I like, I go back and I hide that post, hoping that I sort of cancel out the weight of liking it. And they were trying to hack these tricks to try to get the feed that they wanted. One person said, I wish I could just press a button and get the style of feed I had 2 months ago, or I wish I could get the feed of my partner. And so, this led us to several hypotheses. In our case, it turned out that algorithm awareness increased engagement. People were going back to their feed more after being aware of the algorithm. People did not want to know the full model of the algorithm. They did not want to know 100+ features. They wanted to have some general sense of how it worked, how nudging one input might affect some output. And people really liked the alternative seamed interaction experience, and they asked us for more and more of it. It's not the sort of interface you'd look at every day when you go to Facebook. It turns out it became popular in many design schools. It became popular in CS departments. Unfortunately, we had to phase it out because the API that it used no longer functions. These hypotheses led to some questions, though. Should users be aware of the role of algorithms and filters in their news feeds? And if so, how? And this is where I would love your help, because we're at the baby stages of this. And we came up with 3 different ways to think about showing these algorithms behind the feeds. And so the first one, oops, I'm going ahead of myself, is to undo the bias or prioritization. It turns out this is really hard. You can do this in Facebook by going into the most recent mode and putting things in chronological order. But what does it mean to, unbias a Google feed, for a search? And by whose metric? And is it really unbiased? And then you have an algorithm that unbiases that you have to see so you have this chicken and egg problem. So we really looked more towards a second approach, making the viewer aware of the prioritization, either explicitly or abstractly. And then towards the end, I'm going to show you some examples of letting users choose their own algorithms or prioritizing themselves. And so we started looking at seams and transparency, which we incorporated into the FeedViz interface that I already showed you. And designers of news feeds ultimately want an alignment between the efficacy of the algorithms and the viewer's positive experience. And there's arguments in support of revealing and obscuring computational processes to users. And it's very closely tied to design. This is an example of orbits. This is a nice seamless interface. You put in your origin, you put in your destination, and you get a series of responses to your query. And this lack of awareness of an algorithm in the seamless interface can be indicative of good design in some cases. It turns out, again, this algorithm, a glitch was revealed one day when it turned out that if you used a Macintosh, you got more expensive flights on top than if you used a PC. People became really, really angry that the type of machine that you use influenced the prioritization or the ordering of your feed. Another example that I would not imagine I would be advocating 10 years ago is a more seamful feed, or more seamful interface, rather. So conversely, some have argued for visible seams in designs. Like this is the kayak interface. Again, you put an origin and destination, but you also start getting these other interfaces popping up, showing you the provenance of what actually shows up in that long feed of responses to your query. And this we're not the first to come up with this. This was designed, that came up by Matthew Chalmers in 2003. And he was looking at this in the context of 802.11 and cell phone coverage. And so what they were showing is that if you look at an interface like this, you can also learn from it. It's not just getting these bars, but you have a sense for how exactly Wi-Fi coverage works. Where on campus I might go? Maybe I should go closer to Windows. Maybe I should go to this part of the campus. And it turns out that by having this interface that is typically used when something is broken or used by the sysadmins, you can actually learn something and benefit from it. And so our interface borrowed very much from this. You see other interfaces like this today as well. This is done by the Wall Street Journal, and this uses the Facebook algorithm. So on the left, you're seeing liberal posts. On the right, you're seeing more conservative posts. And they're using a comparison view to highlight the seam. Note this is a little different because it also uses an algorithm to choose which post to show in each of those. And again, there's lots of different ways to highlight these seams. These are just some of them. In terms of trying to show algorithmic awareness, we found out that we could play with the design of the interface as well. This interface was built by the amazing Eric Gilbert. It was called WeMetal. And what he did here is he built an interface for Twitter, a new client for Twitter. And so at a glance, you can probably tell that the typeface is a little bit different as you look at it. Not all text is presented the same. And so what he has here on the left is a social zooming scroll bar. If you move this bar to the top, you see more posts from your inner circle. You move this to the bottom, you see more posts from your outer circle. And then again, as you move it, the text changes. So if it's at the top, you see the bold of your inner circle. You see it being more in the serif font. Everything else falls into a smaller, not as black font. Also, you can collapse certain things. If somebody posts 10 things, you can collapse clicking on this paper airplane to see the most representative post of that person at that time. The idea being that you have control, but also by changing the typography here and the layout, you have some sense that something is going on. There's something different about this post than this post, and what might it be? And how might I play with these levers up here to actually see what's happening? You could also look at just positive tweets, negative tweets, frequent posters, infrequent posters. What was interesting about this interface is that people in the beginning really preferred to see posts from their outer circle, from people that they didn't know as well, because they realized that they were seeing all the same tweets anyway from folks in their inner circle. And they really preferred to see folks tweets from infrequent posters. And this idea of reconfiguring your feed, we're starting to see more. Like I already showed you this example of Google News, where you can actually start using some of these levers yourself. And we're starting to see some examples of the typeface changes in the Twitter interface when you look at yourself. So depending on whether or not something is liked or it gets retweeted, the typography is starting to change, but only in this view. But there's other directions we can take this in. I was a big fan of the system called Trove, designed by Commander Taco. How many of you are familiar with it? Okay, we have one person. He was working at the Wall Street Journal. And he decided to build, he was one of the creators of Slashdot, he decided to build a new style of feed experience. And the idea there is, well, maybe this is the feed that I have, but I have a friend who makes the best Star Wars feed ever. So I'm going to borrow some of my friend's feed, and I'm going to borrow some of this and borrow some of that. And so you do know that there's a sense of an algorithm there because you can't see everything, and it makes it clear that you don't see everything, but you choose who you borrow from. And it grows organically. So I don't think this exists today, but I think there's some interesting design lessons we can learn from this and how to move forward from it. And again, the main message here is moving further beyond being there through active user engagement. And in some ways, what we're seeing when we look at this is a new type of algorithmic awareness and a new type of bias. And we found this in some of the other work that we've done. We were looking at Twitter, and we were trying to figure out during Twitter queries why you got what you got in political searches. So for example, let's say I go onto Twitter and I search for President Trump. I get certain results out. It turns out, however, that most of Twitter just happens to be Democratic. The content on it, on the corpus of Twitter, is Democratic. So should you know that when you do a query on Twitter? Is that important? What we discovered was that in December of 2015, it was much more difficult to be Republican on Twitter than it was to be Democrat. And what do I mean by that? Here, we were trying to show people the leaning of this tweet, and we also tried to show people the actual training data, if you call it, or the corpus of Twitter. It's a really, really complex design problem, and I'll tell you how we got to that. So in studying this bias, we were looking at the input to Twitter, meaning the entire Twitter corpus, the algorithm that ranks the searches that you do on Twitter, and the output that you get. So I have this huge Twitter corpus, and it turns out that if I'm searching for Donald Trump, and notice there's a bias in my scale here. 1 is very Democratic, -1 is Republican. So already there's some bias that I'm putting into the way I'm thinking about it. So It turns out if I put the input query, Donald Trump, that term is 0.19, meaning it's slightly democratic even to begin with, because most people on Twitter, when they mention his name, say something derogatory about him. It turns out that the bias, the algorithm, adds 0.1 democraticness to it, so the output is even more democratic. So there's this bias in Twitter. How do we highlight this? And this is a problem I would love for you to give me ideas for, because people maybe should know that the corpus tends to be skewed in this one way. And maybe if they have multiple different corpora that they work with, maybe they can choose which one they want to work with based on what the corpus contains. And this bias we started seeing in many places, not just here. For example, in the world of vision, there was an HP camera that can't see certain faces. And this led us into a whole new world realm of work. An example of that camera here.
Now, as you can see, the camera is panning to show Wanda's face. It's following her around. But as soon as my blackness enters the frame, which I will sneak into the frame. I'm sneaking in, I'm in there.
That's it.
And there we go, it stopped. My hands are here. Wanda, please get back in the frame. Get back in. As soon as white Wanda appears, Black Desi gets in there. Oh, nope. No face recognition anymore, buddy.
And so, one might guess how this might happen. It's very possible that in this lab, maybe they were mostly white people working there, and possibly they used their own faces for a training set. I can't say for sure. But this idea of understanding what's in your training set is really, really, really important, especially given the demographics of the country we live in and demographics of the users of many of these tools. This idea of bias is seen in other places as well. It turns out there's this tool called Street Bump, July of 2012. People had a smartphone. Using the smartphone, they can report potholes. And it just so happened that the potholes in the wealthy suburban areas of town were getting fixed, and potholes in more poor areas of town were not getting fixed. President Obama, in April of 2014, started an active discussion about how big data can discriminate. Another example of a more social part of a social technical system was the Amazon Prime same-day delivery. How many of you have ever used it? It's really convenient. If you're poor and want to buy diapers, you can walk down to the shop and pay like $10 for 3 diapers, or you can order a big box and it comes to your house in 2 hours. It turns out in Boston, where I used to live, this area of Roxbury does not have the Amazon Prime service like that. It turns out that's one of the poorer parts of the city. By making this visible, by making this public, Amazon actually did something about it in 3 of the cities. But again, whenever we design algorithms, whenever we design systems, whether they're social systems, technical systems, or socio-technical systems, we have to start thinking about these outcomes that evolve from them. The other extreme is predictive policing, and we've already seen examples of mistakes happening on this, again, because of certain biases that are put into the system. Another example is Pokemon Go locations. There are fewer Pokemon Go locations in Black neighborhoods, and people were trying to figure out why. And there's a huge history for why this might be, but the outcome was there. And as we were looking at all these different examples, we were also doing work at the same time trying to find differences in discrimination in housing. And so with wonderful colleagues, Christian Sandvik, Kevin Hamilton, and Cedric Lambert, we were looking at different minorities and housing expectations and housing outcomes. And we wrote this paper on auditing algorithms, this idea that maybe we should be auditing these algorithms. And if we can't audit them from the inside in the companies, we should be auditing them from the outside. And how might we do that? And our first project addressed housing. So it turns out that in 1964, the Civil Rights Act decreed that race simply could not be considered in some situations, regardless of context, nuances, or consequences. The Fair Housing Act in 1968 originally prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. And in 1988, it added disability and familial status. The Housing and Community Development Act of 1987, whereby the Department of Housing and Urban Development enforced the Fair Housing Act. It supported special projects that included development of prototypes to respond to newer, sophisticated forms of discrimination against persons protected. And that's what really got us excited. So there already is a practice for this in housing today. Can we do something like this online using algorithms? And so the traditional audit today goes like this. People create matched pairs on family and economic features. These pairs successfully visit realtors, and the researchers control and isolate discrimination. The first case of this happening was in 1977. And this still happens today. And while things are better, they're not perfect. So it turns out that compared to whites, blacks are told about 17% fewer homes and shown about 17.7% fewer homes. Compared to whites, Asians are told about 15.5% fewer homes and shown 18.8% fewer homes. And this is in walking into face-to-face worlds. What happens online? We really, really wanted to study this, and we began to do it. But we encountered some problems. We encountered some problems with terms of service and the scraping of websites. And this leads sort of to the other weaving that I mentioned. And so in this paper, we discuss about different ways to audit algorithms, and I'm going to discuss part of those and some policy. So the first thing you can do to audit some of these algorithms is get the code. It's very unlikely anybody is going to give you access to the Google source. It's very unlikely Facebook is going to give us access to the Facebook feed code. But it's one way you can do it. Some researchers did give us their code. This was a famous project in 1996 about finding naked people. It was done by Margaret Fleck and David Forsyth. And what they did is they had an algorithm where they pre-processed color, smoothed, and detected skin. They had a similar problem that happened with the HP camera that I just showed you. It turns out that their first algorithm just did not find black bodies. It found white naked bodies, found them on eBay, reflections on eBay, did not find black bodies. And they actually went in and changed the code where that happened. And that leads to another ethical discussion that I could go into offline if anybody's interested. But this is one of those few cases where you can get the code. Another example of auditing is where you ask the users, which is the approach that we took. We sat people in the lab, we showed them something, interrogated them, and got some insight. Another thing you can do is you can collect data manually. And this is really, really hard, but many of us do this when we don't want to violate terms of service. And one of the best examples of this I've seen has been by LaTanya Sweeney. What LaTanya Sweeney did is she put in search queries into Google. And in this case, she put in the name Karrie, kind of a very generic name. And she got like these ads on the side that said Karrie was located, public records found for her, and she was found. You put in a different name. You put a name like Keisha Bentley, and all of a sudden, some of the ads that you get are Keisha Bentley arrested. And she found this consistently whenever you put in white names or black names, the same types of patterns emerged. And she obviously became sick, but she did this with over 2,000 names by hand to get at this data. How can we highlight that there's a bias in some of these advertisements that are happening? The other approach you can use is to scrape everything. And we've done that. I admit we violated terms of service in the past to do that. In this case with FeedViz, we decided not to do that. We went out of our way to be good citizens. We didn't want to, anger our colleagues at Facebook, but also we didn't want to put undue load on the system. Millions of people use Facebook every single day. We don't want to do anything that would damage the infrastructure of Facebook. But at the same time, even though it would be so easy to scrape this and replicate the system that we had before, we chose not to do it because of terms of service, because we did not want to violate it. Another reason for this, it got a longer discussion started in the hackathon at the University of Illinois. It turns out, going through the hackathon projects, roughly more than half of them violated terms of service. And it turns out terms of service falls under the umbrella of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, which is a federal crime. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. The other approach that we can use is a sock puppet. How many of you know what a sock puppet is? Okay, a few of you. The idea here is that you actually create an account for an identity. You make many of these accounts, hundreds in some cases. You let them out into the world. Let's say you ask them to look at houses, try to get jobs, and see what comes back. Again, this is probably the best way to directly mimic the traditional audit that we've seen in the past. And one of the best studies I've seen done here was by Benjamin Edelman, Michael Luca, and Dan Svirsky, where they looked at racial discrimination in the sharing economy, specifically in Airbnb. And what they found were that distinctively African American names are 16% less likely to be accepted relative to identical guests with distinctively white names. Discrimination occurred among landlords of all sizes, including small landlords sharing the property and larger landlords with multiple properties. It suggests that Airbnb's current design choices facilitate discrimination and raise the possibility of erasing some of these civil rights gains that we've made in the last few years. Also, something that is not as known is that he actually had his rights revoked from this site. It was taken down. He was no longer allowed to use Airbnb. They contacted him. They said, you must stop. It was only after lots of public backlash that he was able to get an Airbnb account again. Just to move quickly, the other approach, the last approach, is the collective audit. And I think this is really exciting, especially in the world of collective reasoning and crowdsourcing. But what can you do when you get lots of people coming together? This is a site called Bidding for Travel, where people share their experiences finding flights online and the prices for flights, and trying to work together to actually try to find the best time to get a flight and the right price for it. It's really hard, though. You need an infrastructure that supports this. You need to have something like some of your work to be able to actually get people to organize, to do this in a way to make sense of the information that comes out. And so a lot of this, because we were coming at roadblocks trying to look at some of this housing work and employment work, we ended up suing the US government. And we got lucky that right before we did that, the White House released this document from the Office of the President on big data, a report on algorithmic systems, opportunity, and civil rights. And they named 5 national priorities that are essential for the development of big data technologies. And one of them was algorithm auditing. They said they wanted to promote academic research and industry development of algorithmic auditing and external testing of big data systems to ensure that people are being treated fairly. And so the problem here was the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. How many of you are familiar with it? Okay, some of you. There's a story, I don't know how true it is, but there's a story that this act came about after Ronald Reagan saw the movie War Games. It's a fun story to say, but I can't say for a fact if it's true. But the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act criminalized certain computer-related acts. Many people in the security field and discrimination field have pretty much denounced it, saying that we could all go to jail for security research at any moment and a jury would happily convict us. Scraping remains very common in the computer science community. There's been some wonderful work by Jessica Vitek showing how different communities view this differently, and the different social norms and different research norms in different communities, and I think that's worth noting. In computer science, we were getting worried, like lots of our students in these hackathons were violating terms of service. What might happen to them? Students at universities are being told to be innovative. They're being told to step outside of the box, and students were getting in trouble. What can be done there? And some universities like MIT and BU have come together and they've made this wonderful law clinic for students to tell them about their rights. The Electronic Frontier Foundation has put up this wonderful website about coders' rights. We took a different approach. We're working again with my colleagues, Christian, Alan Mislove, Christopher Wilson, and a media company, First Look Media, with the amazing lawyers of the ACLU, sued the US government, specifically the Attorney General, to be able to do this research on discrimination. And so the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act was really what was holding us back in some cases. And it's a very vague law. It says whoever intentionally accesses a computer without authorization or exceeds authorized access and thereby obtains, and so on. But it's this concept of what does it mean to exceed authorized access? This language has been repeatedly interpreted by courts and the federal government to prohibit accessing a publicly available website in a manner that violates the website's terms of service. The violation, the cost of this violation is pretty harsh. It carries a 1-year maximum prison sentence and a fine. A second or subsequent violation carries a prison sentence of up to 10 years and a fine. And it contains no requirement of intent to cause harm or of actual harm stemming from the prohibited conduct before imposing these criminal penalties. And so this leads to another interesting issue about terms of service, in that how many of you have ever read the terms of service of the sites that you looked at? Okay, wow, it's so nice to see a hand go up. They tend to be over 10,000 words. They tend to be written in very legalese language. They're very, very hard to interpret. And they're very, very, very long, and they're very, very cut and pasty, to say the least. We've noticed lots of people just cut and paste other people's terms of service. This is an example of terms of service for automated collection. The top is Facebook. You basically say that you agree that you're not going to use automated means such as harvesting bots, robots, spiders, or scrapers without prior permission. Bottom is Pokemon Go. You're not going to extract, scrape, index, copy, or mirror the services or content or portions thereof of the content on that site. Other examples include identifiers. So you're not going to manipulate identifiers or the sock puppets that I talked about earlier to disguise the origin of any content. You're not going to impersonate or misrepresent your affiliation with another person or entity. It turns out on Google, you can have multiple accounts. On Facebook, you cannot. The best terms of service I think I've seen to date have been Wikipedia's, where they encourage you to scrape away. That's not the norm. This case is probably one of the most surprising ones. In this case, homes.com basically says that you cannot use automated means, methodology, algorithm, or device, or any manual process for any purpose with that data. Does that mean you can't take a pen and paper and write down the price of homes? It's unclear. Some terms of service go on to say that you can't publish anything in any form. So for anyone who publishes in a conference, let's say you look at a site, you write down some data and you want to publish a paper. That terms of service is very far-reaching. It's one of the most overreaching terms of service, as our lawyers said they've seen. You also can't reverse engineer. One of the things I didn't mention earlier was that when doing the FeedFits project, our first step was we were going to reverse engineer it. We're computer scientists. We're going to sit back and we're going to figure out how this algorithm works, and that's what we need to do. And it turns out, as we were doing that, nobody cared. Nobody wanted that. It turns out that humans don't want to know all of these features in an algorithm. Humans want to know what the outcome of an input means to them. And so we actually had to strip down the interface quite a bit. But even if we wanted to continue reverse engineering, many of these terms of service would not allow that. Also, they're not static. It turns out that they reserve the right, in many cases, to update and modify terms of use at any time without notice. And if you want to look back, you can't even find what the terms of service were when you started a study. We started a study once, and 6 months later, the terms of service were different, and we didn't even know if we could publish it. You can't go onto the Wayback Machine because oftentimes terms of service didn't exist when you started, and they exist now, and it says you can't publish it. And this one is even more interesting in some ways. Basically, you agree that disputes between you and Niantic, in this case the Pokemon Go company, will be resolved by binding individual arbitration, and you are waiving your right to a trial by jury or to participate as a plaintiff or class member in any purported class action or representative proceeding. So you give up your rights with some of these terms of service. And so I've given you this long tale about how we need to design for algorithmic awareness and some of the drawbacks of algorithmic awareness, and bias being one of the more critical ones. And I firmly believe that design is one of the solutions we should try. In this case, we're also trying a policy approach with design. And I don't know what's going to happen. The government tried to dismiss our lawsuit the first time around, and we're still waiting. But I think the design approach is still in the baby steps, and we can all work on that together. Designers have for a long time faced ethical questions about harm caused by their design versus expected benefits. That's not new. There are frameworks that have long been used and can be adapted to this online realm, but we also need new approaches that go beyond what we've done today. And I hope we can start that discussion here. Thank you.